So we're in Revelation 6 this morning, Revelation chapter 6. I was wondering whether we'd get through the whole chapter or not this morning, but we're just going to make it through the beginning seals of the Four Horsemen, so the first four seals. And so we'll start this morning in Revelation chapter 6. So we begin our look today at the scroll of the Lamb. So we begin our look at the scroll of the Lamb with the breaking of the seals. But before we get into those individual seals and what they are telling us, I want to talk about a few different options of the way that people interpret and understand these prophecies of the end times before we dive into the perspective that I will present. Because there are just so many different ways that people approach Revelation chapter 6 through chapter 20. Now, when it comes to Revelation 1 through 5 and then Revelation 21 through 22, while people are not unified in their views of those passages by any means, we find the standard separation of interpretations that we get in the Gospels or the Apostles of Paul. But when it comes to Revelation 6 through 20, the differences of approach to these chapters are just wild in how varying and different they are, and some I don't agree with at all, but I want to be as humble as possible when it comes to these prophecies and to say that, maybe I could be wrong, maybe they will be fulfilled in a few other ways. So I want to present a couple of options before we dive into how I think we should look at this period that dispensationalists call the 7-year tribulation time. The first view is a view that there is the seal judgments that we'll be looking at this morning represent the church age. The seal judgments describe the world in which we are living now. And basically the people who take that view say that conquest, war, famine, those are things that's happened throughout the church age, and they're going to continue to happen all the way until Jesus Christ comes back. And so these are not major disasters that are taking place over a short period of time, but it's like taking these disasters and spreading them out over a couple of thousand years. So they're not good, but this is what's going to happen until Jesus comes back and people say, look at the world around us. You see people doing war, you see conquest, you see famine. All of that occurs during this time period. And then following seeing the seal judgments in the church age, they believe that the bowl and trumpet judgments will take place together at the same time over a very short period of time. And then after that really short period of time with the bowl and the trumpets, you will have Jesus come back. And so most of the people who take this view of having the seal judgments in the church age and the bowl and the trumpet judgments right before Jesus comes back, they will be those who hold to a pre-tribulationist view of the rapture, or also what is known as those who believe in historic premillennialism. So if someone says, I believe in a post-tribulational rapture or historic premillennialism, this is one way that they might take the judgments that we're about to look at. There's a second view, and that sees the seal, bowl, and trumpet judgments all taking place the same period of time. And so the seal judgments that they go through, then the bowl and the trumpet judgments, what they say is that those are all the same thing. The first seal is also the first bowl, which is also the first trumpet judgment. And they're just looking at those judgments from kind of a little bit different perspective. And so they're all taking place at the same time period. And then they would also say that these also take place over a really brief time period. As in, this is how brief it is. They say the start of Christ's return is the beginning of the first seal judgment, the beginning of the first bowl judgment, the beginning of the first trumpet judgment. And then these judgments are describing what happens in the midst of the return of Jesus Christ. So a lot of people who hold to this view also reject a literal millennial at the end of the tribulation period. They would call themselves amillennial. And there's more amillennial views than this one, but I'm not going to go through all of the different ways that amillennialists take the tribulation judgments. The third view is the view that you have a 7-year period of time for the tribulation, which is the viewpoint that we're going to take. And there are people who say that during that 7-year period of tribulation, you'll have the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, the bowl judgments, but all of those take place the same period of time. As I said before, it's the idea that the first seal judgment, first bowl judgment, first trumpet judgment, they're the same judgment. Then the second judgment, the second seal, second trumpet, second bowl, those are also the same thing. And they're just looking at them from a different perspective. So what they're saying is that what John is doing in the scroll and trumpet and bowl judgments, they're just giving three different perspectives of the same time period of judgment. So one of the reasons that they get this view is that at the end of the trumpet judgments, the last trumpet, it says, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. So that kind of sounds like it's saying, look, now the last trumpets happen, and now the kingdom is Christ. The bowl judgment obviously ends with Christ coming back. And then the seal judgments, the last seal judgment, which is actually the first of them, the last seal judgment has people saying, I'm hiding because of the wrath of the Lamb, and that's saying because they see the Lamb that is coming. I think there's enough parallels between these three judgments to say that that is a possibility, but that's not the way that I take it. I think the most natural way to see this section of Revelation is to just read it in chronological order, and that is the seal judgments will come, and then the trumpet judgments will come, and then the bowl judgments will happen after those. And so what the order will present it as the seal and trumpet judgments take place over 3.5 years. And then we have the middle point of the tribulation period. And then the bowl judgments will cover the final 3.5 years of the tribulation period. So I think this is the most logical order, just walking through the text. And so that's how I will present it to you. But I'll let you know that these are the few other ways. And there's a lot more that people present, but those are probably the most common other ways that people look at Revelation 6 through 20. So one more thing, though, before we get into the seals, and that is, I've said a couple of times about this being a 7-year tribulation period. And one thing you'll notice in Revelation, it never talks about this period lasting 7 years. So where do I get that time period come from? That actually comes from the book of Daniel. So the length of the tribulation period, seeing it as 7 years, comes from what is known as the 70 weeks of Daniel in Daniel chapter 9. I preached on this probably about a year ago. Maybe I'll send out an email with a link to that sermon that I had on Daniel 9 if you want to go and look into all the weeds of that passage and see how to understand this. But basically the idea is in the Hebrew in Daniel 9, it doesn't actually say 70 weeks. It's a bad translation. It's not the word for weeks, but it's just 70 periods. So 70 periods of time. And each single one of those period of time take up 7 years. And so what we see in Daniel is that for those 70-year periods that Daniel predicts, so 70 periods of 7 years, the first 69 takes us right up to the coming of Jesus Christ. So if you go from the time where Nehemiah went to rebuild Jerusalem up until the time when Jesus Christ came into Jerusalem and died on the cross for our sins, that's the same time period as, and I'm not going to do the math in my head because I know it was doing it wrong. I probably should have wrote it down beforehand, but that's 69 periods of 7 years. And that takes us right to the coming of Christ. I think it's 483 years now, if I'm remembering right. So after that 483 years, Jesus died. Well, we're left with one 7-year period left. So there's one more 7-year period. The way that Daniel 9 reads it, in my opinion, is there's a gap between the 69th and the 70th week. And so we get that 7-year period from the book of Daniel, as we believe that this is a prediction of Daniel's 70th week. So I think the time period works out perfect. Daniel also talks about a major event happening in the middle of that 7-year period, which again we'll see in the book of Revelation, and we'll talk about what that is when we get close to it. But the reason that we take a 7-year time period for all of this to last is not found in Revelation, but it's found in the book of Daniel. So with that being said, let's move on to the seals. And we'll start with Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. And I'm going to talk about a couple of introductory things about the seals before we get into what the seals actually are. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the 7 seals. And I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying, as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Before we look at all the seals individually, what I want to talk about first is two key words that come up again and again in Revelation chapter 6 that are clearly the key words in order to understand these seals as a whole. And those two words are words that might not stand out a lot unless you notice them, but they come up again and again. And they are the words come and give. Come and give. And they both point to the same spiritual truth. And that is God is in control of all that will happen at the end of days. God is ruling from heaven. Even when it looks like the entire world is spinning out of control and things couldn't be any more worse than they are. People are dying by the billions. The world is running out of food. God still reigns. Now, there's some debate if the living creatures are calling John to come and see, or if the living creatures are calling for the horsemen to come and act. I think probably the better interpretation is that he's calling for the horsemen to come and act. He's not calling for John to see. So what the living creatures is saying is that God is calling for these events to happen. And then when we look at the end of this chapter in verses 16 and 17, so at the end of Revelation 6, we read this. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, who is able to stand. So when the wrath falls on the end of the world, the great day of the wrath of the Lamb, the world will testify who brought this wrath upon them. How has this wrath come? It's come by the power of the Lamb of God. It's come through the judgment work of the four horsemen who were unleashed at the command of God. So this is being directed by God's power. And then the second main word is the word given. The first horseman we will read is given a crown. The second horseman is given power with a great sword. Authority is given to death in the fourth seal. Later on in these seals, the saints will be given white robes in heaven. So all of this is able to happen because God is giving authority. God is giving power. God is giving grace depending upon the circumstances. So again, the emphasis is on God saying come, God giving. So it's on God's direction and God's ruling. And I actually think that this might be the most important note, the most important interpretation and application maybe in all of the book of Revelation is understanding this point. Because remember who this book's written for. This book is written for first century Christians who are suffering all kinds of persecution, temptation. They're sitting there wondering, why in the world has Jesus not come back yet? Like, it might seem crazy for us 2,000 years later that Jesus hasn't come back yet, but I'm going to guess for them, it probably seemed far more crazy that Jesus had not returned yet. The apostles are dying out. They're being persecuted. They're still living under the thumb of Rome. They don't get how this could be happening. Jesus is supposed to be king. Why aren't they ruling? Well, what's being shown to them is that no matter how crazy and chaotic things are, even when things are at their bleakest and darkest right before the return of Christ, even in those circumstances, who's reigning and ruling? God is. Who's giving the power and who's giving the authority? God is. God is not sitting up in heaven in glory with his hands tied behind his back as the world goes about doing their things. No, God is ruling, God is reigning, and God is working out his plans. So no matter how terrible, chaotic, no matter how deep the persecution was for those early Christians, when they might begin to be thinking, am I on the wrong team here? Do I need to switch sides? It doesn't look like we're winning. It looks like we're losing, and we're not only losing, we're losing bad. Well, Revelation comes to them and says, one day things will be at their absolute worst. And when they're at their absolute worst, you know what that means? it means Jesus is right around the corner. It means God's reigning and God's ruling, and so we can be confident in him. And so the main theme of the seal judgments is that when this time period happens, right before the return of Christ, when the world is as bleak as it can be, God is still ruling on his throne. And one final word before we get to the actual seals, and again, this might seem odd to us, that when we open these seals of the revelation of Jesus Christ, the prophecy of the coming of the Messiah, it begins with so much judgment. It's so dark. Like, I don't know about you, but I would assume if you're opening the scroll of the return of Jesus Christ, it should be light, it should be beauty, it should be victory, but it's not. If you're a student of the minor prophets, though, and we just walked through the minor prophets, one thing that you should remember is that what was prophesied again and again and again and again in the minor prophets, and that was what's going to happen right before the Messiah comes. It's going to be turmoil. There's going to be war. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be devastation right before God sends his good shepherd. So a student of the prophets of the Old Testament, if they're reading Revelation, they're going to read it saying, oh, we're learning more details about what we already knew in the minor prophets. This is aligning beautifully with the revelation we saw before in the prophets that were given to us. And I just want to make sure that we remember that here, that what we're seeing is in line with what we saw before. So don't forget that this isn't really new information. This is just really more details to information we already had before in the prophets. So now after that introduction, let's actually get to the first seal judgment in verse 2. I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him. And he went out conquering and to conquer. So I think there's the most interpretive issues when it comes to this first seal. And that is, who is the rider on the white horse? Now, like I said earlier, there are some Christians in the church, a good number of them, who will tell us that the rider on the white horse is Jesus Christ himself. And this is Jesus returning and Jesus coming to conquer. But man, that is a real difficult view to maintain when you look at everything surrounding there. The biggest reason that it is difficult to maintain is that the next horse that's going to show up in verse 4, the second horseman, will be called another horseman. And that another word is key because that word in the Greek means another of the same kind. So they have two different words for another in the Greek. One means another of a different kind. The other one means another of the same kind. This is another of the same kind. And this tells us that these four horsemen, you don't have like a one Christ-like horseman figure and then four lesser horseman figures below him, but they're all equal horsemen together. And then also these four horsemen are based upon Zechariah chapter 1, where they're seen as a singular unit of four horsemen in Zechariah 1. So I think it's obvious when you look at all the terminology, these four horsemen are meant to be viewed as a unit. And it's funny that we have Christians who don't view them all as a unit because the four horsemen of the apocalypse is so well known that you would find it in pop culture references and comic books and so forth because people have heard about it so often. So this means that the white horseman, I don't think could possibly be Jesus, but this is one that's in the group of the three horsemen that will follow him. And then that brings us, though, to our second question about this horseman, and that is the white horseman the Antichrist? Is he the beast who will become a main character later on in the book of Revelation? And to be honest, I'm not sure. He could be the beast. He could be the Antichrist, but I'm not positive. What we know this horseman will do is he will rule and he will conquer. And seeing him on a white horse, you know, Jesus will be on a white horse later, so you could possibly mistake him for that. We know that the Antichrist or the beast will conquer with a one-world government. So all of that makes sense, that this first figure would be the beast or the Antichrist. But the reason that I'm going to say I'm not certain is that when you look at the following three horsemen, and when you see what they are, I don't believe any of those could be a singular person. obviously, when you see based on what all those horsemen are and what they do. So I think it may be more likely that the white horseman is the government, the one governmental force that will dominate the world, that will conquer it and rule over all others. And my opinion is that based on, like I said, this is the idea of seeing all the four horses as the same kind. And that is, you're talking about something like death or something like famine. And so I think that this is a one world whole government force that's going to take over and conquer all the governments of the world, make a one massive government. And then after they do that, I think the beast is going to rise up from the midst of that government, but not necessarily be the leader at the beginning. I think that that makes more sense looking at the horsemen as a unit. But all this to say then, what is it telling us that's going to happen with the first seal? The first seal is going to be that there's going to be a singular government in the world, a singular national entity that will conquer, dominate, and rule over all of the other nations in the world. He will be successful. He will be successful at a remarkably swift speed. So much so that he will make Hitler at the beginning of World War II in his conquest of Europe seem agonizingly slow, and the conquering of Europe will seem like a child's game in light of what this government is able to do. And so this one government's going to go and it's going to conquer the world. It's going to rule the entire planet. There will be no nation versus nation wars because one government rules them all. And the initial thought will be, oh man, there's going to be peace on earth because we have one government and now other nations can't fight each other. And then what they'll see is, turns out having one government does not mean that there's peace at all. And we see that in verses 3 and 4. When he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. And another horse, a red horse, went out. And to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. So now we have a red horse, and he takes away peace that the conqueror would have thought that he rightfully earned. And I agreed with Leon Morris that in the way that this is worded of one man slaying another man, that this points to what we know as the darkest and most vilest form of warfare in history. And I think the most vile form of warfare in all of history is civil war. And civil war is the worst because you have neighbor against neighbor. You have friend against friend. You have parent against child. And so while the world will experience international peace, it will at the same time have an internal conflict and civil war that will be more destructive than any nation versus nation war we have ever seen before. The imagery here is meant to be very violent, men slaying one another, a great sword given for the slaughter. And this is not pictured as an army rising against another, but the image of a multitude of people all around the globe cutting down their neighbor. And so I'll tell you my theory of how this is going to happen. And again, I'll try to make this clear whenever I do this in Revelation, that this is, Sean's theory, could totally be wrong, probably is wrong, but it's my theory. My theory is that when you have a singular conqueror, a singular army or a singular nation ruling over the entire world, what you're going to end up experiencing in every nation is a split in the population. You're going to have some people who say, look at how powerful this government is. There's no way we could oppose them, so we got to support them and get on their good side with all that we can. And then you're going to have other people in that neighborhood who are going to say, I want my freedom back. I don't want to support him. And all of a sudden, instead of these two neighbors fighting the government who oppose them, they're going to fight each other. With one neighbor saying, I want to support the ruler who's over me, and another neighbor saying, I want to get my freedoms back. This type of violence happened all of the time. at the founding of the Soviet Union and also after the communists took over China, where people were encouraged by the government to turn against their neighbors who weren't loyal enough to the new government. And I mean, really the most brutal times in history were when the Soviets took over and when the communists took over in China. I mean, it was grotesque and horrendous. And, we were sending troops in because the Nazis took over Poland. But I mean, the communists in Russia did worse to their own people when they took over there. It just was their own people, so we just let it go like it was their own problem. But I think this is what's going to happen all across the world. We're going to have that one world government, and we're going to have neighbors fighting against each other all over the globe for those who support and those who oppose this government. So while it will seem, like, oh, great, peace on earth, one government, it's going to dissolve into massive chaos really quickly, which will then lead very naturally to the third consequence, the third seal. I shouldn't say third consequence, but naturally to the third seal in verses 5 and 6. When he broke the third seal, I heard of the third living creature saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hands. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine." The black horse and its rider. So interestingly enough, this horseman is the only one of the four who is not given anything. So he's not given anything, and I believe the reason he's not given anything is that the third seal is a natural result of the first 2 seals. So if you think about it, if you have a one world government come and conquer over the whole world, try to reset up new local governments all over the planet, and then you have neighbor fighting against neighbor in civil war, what will be a natural occurrence of what will happen? You're going to run out of food. And then food's going to get really expensive really fast. And so the third point is a famine of food. But it might not be as bad as our knee-jerk reaction to this third seal might take. This is, I think, is one of the few instances in Revelation where our thoughts of how bad a seal might be is probably not as bad as the actual seal is going to be. Because when we hear famine, we think, black horse famine. People are just going to be starving to death on the sides of the street. That's not actually what it says. It doesn't say that food will be impossible to come by and that people will starve to death, but what this really says is that food will be very expensive. And that's what the scales are meant to indicate that the black rider has. And that is, it'll take a large weight of coin in order to buy the amount of food that you would like to have. So the famine is described as a quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine. My favorite unit of money in all of the Bible is the denarius. The reason I love the denarius is because it's really easy to understand how much a denarius is worth, regardless of the changing of economic standards and the dollar and so forth. Because a denarius equals 1 day's wage. So if you want to know how a denarius translates to any society in the world, well, a denarius should translate into how much money an average person would make on an average day, because that's what a denarius was set to be in the Roman world. You paid a worker a denarius for 1 day's of work. So by saying a quart of wheat is a denarius, here's what he's saying. A quart of wheat is the amount of wheat that it would take to make 1 day's worth of food. So if you were to just eat wheat turned into bread and made that into food, that would give you enough nutrients in food for a day. 3 quarters of barley, same thing. That'll give you a day's worth of food. So if all of a sudden you're taking a day's wage and then you're getting a day's worth of food, what is that saying? All of your income is going to food. You're going to work all day long, and then you're going to have enough money to have food for 1 day. And then don't damage the oil and the wine, because it's so precious and so valuable. We can't afford to drink it. We can't afford to use it, because all of our money is going toward the wheat and the barley. So I think what this is saying is not that people are starving to death, but that all of the luxuries that people enjoy, all of the luxuries that we enjoy in life today, electricity, cell phone, insurance plans. I mean, it's a luxury to have insurance. I mean, it's really nice when you need it. All of those modern enjoyments will go by the wayside, and we will have to forsake them, because suddenly when it becomes, I have enough food for the day, or I keep my Netflix subscription, well, we're going to drop Netflix so that we can continue to eat. And people are going to learn how important food and water is at the end of days. So I see this more as pointing toward a lifestyle of poverty than a lifestyle of starvation. If all you can do is afford food and water, and then wine and oil are seen as luxuries, you aren't starving to death, but you are really, really poor. And I think you also see that from the fact that he is holding the scale. So this is showing that there will be a worldwide poverty that will take place as a result of the conquest, and then also the inner turmoil, civil war of that time period. I remember some years ago, I heard somebody giving an interview who had grown up at the very end of the Great Depression and then during World War II. And they asked him, what was it like living in the Great Depression? And his response just shocked me. He goes, the Great Depression was bad. Obviously it was not good. It was a depression. He's like, but World War II, he's like, that was way worse. He's like, I felt like we were way more impoverished in our household after the war started, because everything that we had, what was it going to as a kid? It was all going to the war effort. He goes, people had a better attitude about being poor during World War II, but he goes, I felt like as a boy, we were more poor during the during the final days of World War II than we were during the Great Depression. And so I think we're going to see this across the world during this time period, and that is just an extreme poverty that will take place during that time period. And then that will bring us to seal number 4 in verses 7 and 8. When the Lamb broke the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following him. Authority was given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So this 4th horseman is given authority. So I take this one not as a result of the 3 that came before, but this horseman, I don't know, would you call death a force? Can't recall it a person. I don't know what you'd call death, but this horseman was given this authority to bring death upon the earth. So again, I'd say this is not an individual person. I don't think it's a demon, but I just think this means lots of people are dying. And to get a good picture of what this death looks like, we need to make sure that we know what the horse looks like. Our English Bibles say it is an ashen horse. So I'd picture like a grayish horse, but not really the best translation is ashen. This horse is actually said to be the color of chloros. The Greek word chloros is the word from which we get our English word chlorine, and it is a yellowish green color. And it was specifically the color that you'd say that described a person right before they died, or they were so sick they were turning green. That's this color. They had a specific color for it, and it was chloros. So this is a horse that looks so horribly dead, so horribly sick, that it is on the verge of death. But the people who are a result of this horse, they will not be on the verge of death, but we read that 1/4 of the earth will die. And 1/4 of the earth will die primarily through 4 ways: sword, hunger, pestilence, and wildlife. Now, the big question for me with this one, and I go back and forth in how I lean on this one, and that is the 4th seal a separate seal from the first 3 that came before, or is the 4th seal a summary of the first seal that came before? So what I mean by that is, so it talks about 1/4 of the world's population dying from these 4 causes. Is this saying that because of the first 3 seals, You'll have a quarter of the world's population die from violence, starvation, disease, and wild animals. Or is it saying you're going to have all of those awful things happen from the first 3 seals, and then after that, you will have so much violence, starvation, disease, and animals that another, on top of all those earlier deaths, you will have another quarter of the world's population die. I'm not really sure. I think the way it's worded, I think it and I almost hate to say this because it's so awful. It's worded in a way that this happens afterwards. This is on top of the 3 that came before. But on the other hand, the 4th seal results in a death of 2 billion people. 2 billion people, if we take a quarter of the world's population. And imagine how many people had to die during the first 3 seals. So you could imagine how many you're talking of the world's population there. So just because of the mass numbers, it makes me think that this is probably including the first 3 seals. But again, it's worded more that this happens on top of what came before. But I don't think we can totally be sure of this. But a couple of notes on the 4 things that cause this death and devastation. 2 of them don't really need comment. Violence, starvation. People die those ways in the world today. Starvation not as often, but obviously violence. We can see through the first 2 seals how that would have happened a lot. The third one, though, the word pestilence, that is just simply the Greek word for death. So it'd say these people are going to die by violence, starvation, death, and disease. Death was most likely used for situations such as a plague, pestilence, those type of deaths. So we're probably thinking disease. It could be a pandemic that'll happen during that time period that'll take millions of deaths. But the one that gets me the most, though, out of these 4 is the fact that it says wild animals is brought up there. Because one thing that's interesting about that is that one of the blessings of modern life is that one thing that we're relatively secure from today is the danger of wildlife. Not a lot of people die from wildlife in the modern world today. Just to kind of put that in perspective, we live in alligator country. There are parks that we visit that just have, alligators, right there sitting. When I've walked on the levee and prayed before, I've seen alligators in the river, right there behind the church. And so we got alligators all over the place. But in all of American history that we know of, there are 26 recorded alligator deaths. That's all we got of recorded alligator deaths, just 26 for all the alligators that are out there. And what I thought was even more intriguing is that anybody got a guess of how many alligator deaths have been in Louisiana that we have recorded? 2. One of them happened in Hurricane Ida. A 78-year-old man died stuck in his home after the storm and was eaten by an alligator. He could have been dead, though, before the alligator even got to him. So we got 2 confirmed deaths in Louisiana, all of history. So there's just not much of a danger from wildlife today. Like, it may scare us when we see this stuff, but we're not really in threat and danger of it. So the fact that wild animals will make this list shows us that what's going to happen during the first 3 seals will so disrupt society and how people live that all of a sudden we'll be at threat to things that we had begun to think, I don't need to worry about those things. And all of a sudden they're going to be threats to our lives as well. And then all of it will result in a death of, like I said, at the minimum, 2 billion people. So there is the beginning of the period of the return of Jesus Christ. We refer to this as the Great Tribulation. The first 4 things that are going to happen at the return of Christ will be the sending of the 4 horsemen. And so the tribulation will begin with a singular military conquest by one great governmental force. There will then be the destruction of civil war taking place around the globe after that government's conquest. And then we'll have global poverty, logically, that will take place after then. And then a massive death resulting in 2 billion casualties. And again, like I said, I think the main purpose of this, though, is to tell these churches at the beginning of church history that even when all of these things are going on, God is still reigning. God is still in control. He is still king. And when things are as dark as they can be, what do you get to say during that time period? Jesus is right around the corner. So no matter how dark things are for us, what is the worst thing that can happen to us in life? We could actually die for our faith. But what does it happen when we die on account of our faith? We're with Christ in glory, and things are infinitely better. And so we get to trust and have confidence in Christ.